right now, I don't see myself doing anything different, and this would be my life purpose because I believe in its urgency, and I also believe in the capabilities that I have.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we explore conventional wisdom in the field of conservation and sometimes the environment more broadly. This episode is a counterpart to the previous episode with Esther Krakue. Esther provided a fairly critical view of environmental activism, with a focus mostly on climate change. With that in mind, I'm joined this time by Omnia El Omrani, a young Egyptian medical doctor and self-described climate activist. Omnia has worked with organizations like the WHO, UN Climate Convention, and the Global Climate and Health Alliance, and she was the youth envoy to the President of COP27, the big UN climate conference hosted by Egypt in late 2022. Omnia comes from a rather different perspective to Esther, and I think that this provides an interesting contrast. I suggest that you listen to these two discussions as a set, but not in any particular order. If you happen to discover this one first, keep listening and then you can hear what Esther has to say later. I felt like Omnia and I spoke past each other a little bit at times, but I wanted to let her say what she had to say without going too far down any factual rabbit holes or getting too specific. And I think the result was still an interesting and valuable conversation. I hope you feel the same way.
The way I started working on environment and health was back in 2016. I was then a second-year medical student, and I joined a global organization of students based in 133 countries, and we had over 1 million medical students from around the world. And I applied to go to an exchange program that was in Miami to do emergency medicine for 1 month, and that was in September. And this was my first time in the US and my first time abroad alone. And on my second weekend, there was Hurricane Irma. And it was the first time for me to see a climate disaster. And at the same time, I had to evacuate my house. I had to go back to the hospital and really see how this event led not only to physical health impacts in terms of like injuries, but also how difficult it was for people to access the basic healthcare services that they needed and the emergencies that they wanted to do, but they couldn't because of the power outages, as well as the anxiety, the stress during the hurricane itself, but also after, where the person that I stayed with lost her job because her pizzeria, the roof was teared down because of Irma. So all of these different impacts, I started to recognize how climate change and the environment are related to my own work as a doctor. But at the same time, I was a bit disappointed that I never learned about climate change in my own education that is supposedly preparing me to be a better doctor. And I realized that also my responsibility doesn't just lie towards my patient or diagnosing different illnesses and diseases, but it also lies towards my community. And climate change affects the health of my people. So when I went back to Egypt, I realized that my organization goes to the climate conference every year, and we do a lot of workshops and sessions for students around health and climate change, but never really in Egypt or in the MENA region because it wasn't a priority then. So I started to do a lot of trainings until I myself became a trainer. I started designing workshops that link health and climate change to medical students. I started looking at medical curricula worldwide across my network. And we did for the first time ever a global survey that assesses whether climate change is in the medical education or not across 112 countries. We saw that less than 15, so 15% of universities worldwide teach climate change. And it was really a good push for me to keep on throughout the past 7 years, working on the environment, on climate change, on biodiversity, and so on. And my very first workshop was actually in Egypt when I gathered around 20 students from 6 different cities around Egypt. And we started talking about climate change and what can we do together. And then I was, very lucky that my country hosted the climate conference, because it was not just the students that I had the opportunity to work with when I was appointed as the envoy. It was all the young people in Egypt working together on climate change across not just the health sector, but all the different sectors, and introducing them to all the different opportunities and how they can link what they do to the environment and to climate change.
Mm-hmm. That climate conference, you're talking about the COP, right? The UNFCCC COP that was in Sharm el Sheikh.
Yes, the COP27.
Right.
And right before COP27, I worked for 2 years with my organization, which is the Federation of Medical Students, as their global focal point. So speaking on their behalf on climate change and environmental issues, together with the World Health Organization, with different UN agencies, as well as deans and faculties. And then afterwards, I was appointed as the envoy, so as the youth envoy, so representing the COP president, who was the Egyptian Minister of Foreign Affairs, to the young people, and as well as representing children and youth to the presidency, and really find a way to integrate youth as well as health into the work of the presidency, into the negotiation process within Egypt as well as globally.
So you say that the hurricane that you experienced in Miami was kind of the trigger that got you interested and concerned about the environment. There does seem to be like a tendency in the media these days, especially, that when a natural disaster happens, to immediately invoke climate change, or to immediately sort of assume that climate change is involved. But there's also, the counter argument is that we've always had natural disasters. I know that the IPCC predicts that climate change will make natural disasters more frequent in some cases and more intense in some cases. But what made you at that time? What made you connect the two things, the natural disaster that you were experiencing there and climate change more generally?
It opened a small door to just exploring what is the link between climate change and health. And the natural answer is always extreme weather events, because it leads to death and to injuries that we can see with our own, bare eyes. But then when I started to learn more, and I brought in, I remember the first manual that my organization did with the World Health Organization that explains how climate change affects health. And I started reading, okay, first of all, if we think about air pollution, which is led by the carbon emissions that lead to climate change, this kills 7 million people every single year and leads to diverse diseases like lung diseases, whether it's asthma, lung cancer, or pneumonia and other infections. But then if we look at the food that we eat, and now because of the crop failures, there is malnutrition. And in more than 15 countries in Africa right now, a child in every second is suffering from acute food stress. They cannot even find the food that they need. And then when we look at the water crisis that we're having because of the drought in many countries around the world, 1 in every 3 children cannot access the water that they need to begin with. And then when we look at other impacts, for example, infectious diseases, and now everyone recognizes that environmentally driven infectious diseases or zoonotic diseases, such as being studied right now with COVID-19, but also other diseases that are increasing and killing more people. And all of this is related to the environment, not to mention, and this is the most important and yet needs to be studied more, which is mental health impacts, especially on my generation. We feel anxious, stressed, depressed because the environment is changing. Our future and our health is being affected now more than ever. And it's only increasing with such a lack of political will to address it. And this is affecting our mental health the most.
So it sounds like maybe you don't share my perception that there is kind of a bit of a disconnect between what the science is saying and what the media is saying, because I know that like the tendency, especially in the last few years in the media, has been to always kind of invoke climate change, to always make the assumption that climate change is involved if there's a wildfire, a big wildfire in California, or a hurricane in the Philippines, or whatever it is. But from what I understand, in the future, they're projecting that the climate change is going to have a bigger effect on the frequency and intensity events, but so far it hasn't made a huge difference. So that's what I mean by the disconnect between the science and the media, and the IPCC science in particular. I'm also thinking about organizations like IPBES, which deal with the biodiversity side of things. What I often see is that the IPBES report gives some pretty straightforward data, but then if you look at the headlines, the news headlines, they tend to select the most shocking and the most extreme scenarios and kind of leave out a little bit of the balance in these equations. You mentioned how young people especially are getting depressed and anxious about this kind of thing. I'm also worried about those people, but I guess my point of view is more like that they shouldn't be worrying so much. They should rather think of this as a solvable problem rather than being anxious about it. So what worries me is that the media is overblowing the science. So I'm curious to know if you feel the same way, or do you think that the media is giving an accurate representation of what the science is saying?
I actually agree, and I always feel like being, a doctor and being in the scientific community, I always see a huge gap between what scientists, researchers, and academia are saying and what the media is showing.
Mm-hmm.
And I would honestly blame it on both of us, because, what we need is a way to simplify the key facts that we are unraveling every day. And at the same time, while providing the science in terms of the impacts of climate change, we also need to put the same effort in providing the solutions on all scales. So whether solutions that an individual person can just wake up tomorrow and do, and the solutions that other sectors need to do, such as the private sector, and solutions that governments need to do. And we need to provide this with the same attention that we give to the impact of climate change on the environment, on species, on biodiversity. And that is why I'm so passionate around the angle that between the environment and health, because health brings in the human message and the motivation and the understanding of why climate change is important, and it is a crisis that we need to respond to, because it doesn't just affect the health of the environment, it affects our own health, the health of our children, the health of our families and our communities that we care most about. A good example of this is how COVID-19, we saw an immediate response on the government level and on the individual level, because it was seen as a health crisis that is leading to right now over 8 million deaths around the world. And climate change is not different from that. It is a health crisis that we need to respond to. On the other hand, with the media, because of the tendency to just highlight what gets people's attention, what they do is, many media outlets simply gives the alarming, catastrophic facts around climate change, but they do not really provide the solutions, even though they have the power to influence behaviors that can help us cope with the crisis. We always say that we need climate adaptation and mitigation. We need to cope with the impacts of climate change because it is happening, but we need to reduce how fast it is. And at the same time, it's also a positive way of, especially for young people, when you become environmentally conscious, when you become responsible, and you do actions that, is going to benefit the environment, is going to benefit the health of your people, and it's going to make you a better person. And the media can help you do that by sharing facts, but also sharing things and solutions that you can do, as well as, if we're talking about fossil fuel companies, we need to also talk about really innovative, sustainable startups that are bringing in new solutions that are groundbreaking to the people, to inspire them to either invest or do the same or start up their own initiatives that help both protect human health and the health of the environment.
Yeah, that's actually a topic that I love to talk about, is the importance of opening the doors to innovation. And I think that, that's kind of course, it's not the only thing. There's a lot of conservation that needs to be happening as well. But I'm quite encouraged to see some of the big governments of the world sort of starting to take a renewed interest in innovation, especially toward more efficient technologies, whether they are renewable or non-renewable, so in both cases, and also beyond climate change policies. There's some pretty encouraging stuff going on there. Just to get back to, and I've asked this, asked my previous guest this question as well. And so I was curious about the same thing in your case. In Egypt in particular, which is presumably the country that you're most familiar with, are most people concerned about the environment, or what are really the main environmental concerns of the average Egyptian?
Yeah, in Egypt in particular, it's a bit different.
Mm-hmm.
And this is my personal opinion, because in Egypt you do not see any direct environmental crises or events.
Mm-hmm.
We understand that in many parts of Egypt there is changes in the crops, which leads to crop failure, and there's a high risk of drought, especially that we are very much dependent on our on the River Nile and so on. But again, we do not see, for example, the wildfires that we're seeing across the region, or we can see a bit of heat waves, but not so much. We are seeing an increase in heat-related deaths, especially in the elderly. But for the past period, it wasn't a priority up until we became the host for the UN Climate Conference. And it was so interesting to see how the prioritization and the shift in mentality was driven by this event. Many people and communities in Egypt understood what climate change is for the first time. All the media outlets were talking about climate change, all the TV shows, the national newspapers. Many of them started being interested to even start a segment on climate change. And that was interesting because once you start influencing the media, you influence the people and their understanding and prioritization. But it's also important to acknowledge that as a country, we are a developing country. We have our own challenges when it comes to economically as well as our access to our needs. So the environment is not yet the priority, the same as other countries around the world. But right now, there is a general awareness and understanding of what climate change is and how, especially in the younger generation, the role that we can play in protecting the environment and thinking or, shifting our ambitions towards working in fields that sustain the environment and being more environmentally conscious.
Egypt is a developing country, like my home country, South Africa. There's quite a stratified society, right? Like there are people who are sort of living more or less a European lifestyle. And then there's the majority of the population who are living in poverty. And I haven't lived in South Africa for many years now, but my perception looking back to like 2010 and before was that the average South African who is relatively poor considers the environment to be kind of a preoccupation of the elite and something which doesn't concern them. And that criticism, I think, has come not just from people like that, but also from just general, political commentators, especially on the right, I guess. But what do you make of that criticism that environmental concerns are elite concerns, and how do we deal with that perception?
I see it a bit differently in Egypt because I feel like communities that are closer to the environment tend to be naturally sustainable and protective of the environment. For example, communities that are living by the Red Sea, for example, they have the most environment-friendly and sustainable behaviors, and they are naturally protecting the environment, protecting biodiversity, and care about the environment regardless of the social circumstances that they are in. In Cairo, it's the same. We have a big neighborhood that have been for so many years always recycling and having their own traditions and their own behaviors that is protecting the environment, also regardless of where they are or their social circumstances, which really brings in the point of whether it's just for the elite or not into perspective, because what we discovered, and that was because of COP, right before, the Ministry of Youth in Egypt collaborated with UNICEF, and they created a caravan that went across 26 cities all over Egypt. And the initial purpose of the caravan was to raise awareness around climate change and around people's perceptions, as well as if they have any ideas. And what they discovered is that, especially in the south of Egypt and by the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea and in the Delta, the people in the cities are already aware of the environmental changes, and they understand what climate change is and how their environment is changing. And based on that, they had so many solutions to tell us about their projects, their small-scale initiatives, either saving water or using plastic bottle bricks to build their own houses. And they already have these solutions that they created to adapt to the changing environment. And there was less need of building awareness. And we actually shifted our aim to more promoting their ideas and their initiatives and finding ways to increase the impact of what they have been doing. So this was an interesting way to see how things are. Sometimes people don't know that this is climate change, and they just know that the environment is being affected, and they don't know why. But then when you start explaining this is because of the carbon emissions that are increasing, because of the industrialization that is happening around the world, and then they start understanding that, okay, there's a reason to what we are doing, but we're already coping with the changes in the environment to be able to live and to be able to protect it from being destroyed the way that they are seeing right now.
So your perception is that the average person in Egypt is kind of fairly open to supporting environmental issues, generally speaking?
Yes, I think that, every person is doing their own solutions. And then when you start learning about them, you would easily just label that this is an environmentally sustainable solution without the person recognizing that. And this is, again, because we had the opportunity to focus on that for an entire year.
Right.
And the challenge right now is how can you sustain the momentum of this and the attention that as a country we decided to focus on, because as the hosts, it's not just about, doing a conference, it's about also utilizing this opportunity to build the capacity, the understanding, the awareness of the people and their motivation and drive towards the environment.
So maybe this is not the neat transition, but I wanted to also talk about the political nature of environmental issues. And I don't know if you share my perception of this, and I think that this might depend very much on where one has spent one's career and experiences and that sort of thing. But it seems to me like environmental issues generally have become increasingly political these days. So I wanted to ask kind of, whether you feel the same way. So please feel free to disagree if you have a different experience. But if you agree, is that something that concerns you, or do you think it's a reasonable, expression of justified public concern?
Yeah, I think that having had the experience to attend the last 4 climate change conferences, I've learned to understand over the years how political it can get. Because it is an issue that concerns both developing and developed countries. And there is the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities, which means that we all have the common goal of protecting the environment, limiting the global temperature to 1.5 and reducing carbon emissions. But at the same time, do developing countries do the same as developed countries? Or do we need support as developing countries to be able to transition and to do it in a just and balanced way? And it's important to acknowledge that it's not just climate change, it's climate justice. And climate justice does not only concern political, context or economical context, but it also concerns generations, where we as the younger generations, we're going to bear the impacts of climate change on our health, on our future. But at the same time, we are not there with the policymakers and the world leaders to decide how to prioritize and how to invest and how to divest from the industries that are harming the environment the most. And I think that it is important to acknowledge that it is a political issue. Um, but at the same time, we need to find ways to, go beyond the slow negotiation process across different political contexts and really find a way forward that is urgent, because we are literally running out of time. And this goes to the first question that you asked, like, is it just a natural disaster, or some countries are feeling it, some countries aren't? But now I see that every single country is seeing the impacts of climate change, whether it's affecting its land, its water, its economy, its people. And we're seeing in countries, especially the small state islands and countries like Pakistan, who had 1/3 of their entire country being submerged underwater because of the flooding, and others seeing catastrophic impacts on their people, on their schools, on their healthcare facilities. And at the same time, the action is slow because it's still very political.
Yeah, there seems to be, again, my perception is that if you look at the empirical science that the IPCC reports, for example, and the IPBES reports present, I think those reports are pretty neutral. I think they do a pretty good job at remaining neutral. But then as soon as you move away from the science into the media world, if you move right, then you move towards people who reckon that there really are no environmental problems to be concerned about, including biodiversity. And then if you move to the left, you get this kind of extreme doomsday, or doomsaying rather, that we were talking about earlier on. Sometimes I wonder, has it always been like that? Maybe I've only really been noticing recently. Maybe it always has been a political issue. I agree with you that to some extent it's unavoidably political. But I also wonder if the avoidable parts will ever change, or if that's just something that we're going to be stuck with.
Yeah, I think when I first started working on climate change, I was a bit, scared of how political it is. But then I started to realize that, because I always thought that I'm young, I was, still 23, and I'm more been focusing my whole life on studying, especially being in medical school and so on. But then I started to realize that it is important to be involved in all the aspects of the environment and climate change, and understanding not just the solutions and the science, but also how to drive political will, how to understand negotiations, how to be involved in it, because it is affecting me more than it's going to affect the negotiator who won't be there to see the impacts as I would see it, and my children and my grandchildren. And it is not something to shy away from and not to speak about, but instead to be vocal, involved, and understanding what it is. It's important to understand and to know all these different aspects and find, your own voice. In that case, find my voice, being neutral, but at the same time, placing health and justice at the heart of this conversation.
We met very briefly, but we met at the CBD COP, not the climate COP, quite recently in Montreal. So that's a biodiversity meeting. As someone with more of a climate interest and a climate background, how did you make that transition? Or was it just something that interested you in like an add-on, or how did you end up at the CBD COP?
Yeah, so when I was in the climate COP and for the many years I was involved in climate change, I worked with the World Health Organization. And one of the people I worked with invited me to speak in a pre-COP15 workshop in Montreal that links health, biodiversity, and climate change with a focus on food systems. And it was an eye-opener for me, not just to speak in that workshop, but to understand not just the science, but also the work that is being done by different organizations around health and biodiversity, and the One Health approach, which is the link between animal health, health of the environment, and human health, which was one of the key aspects that was being discussed in the negotiations during the CBD COP. And this was led by the COVID-19 pandemic, how it's important to think about these three different aspects and to find ways to translate it from science into policy, into real action by countries on the ground. That it's not just involving the ministries of environment, but also the ministries of health around the work of biodiversity and health. Because right now, and this is the most obvious link, which is food systems. Our food systems now are not sustainable. They're not good for our health, nor for the health of the environment. And we need to change that from changing the way that we consume food, the way that we need to reduce our waste, our food waste, to the ways that we are producing food in general and how unsustainable it is for our environment and for our health systems and our healthcare.
Other than food waste, what do you regard as being unsustainable about the way that we're producing food? Because, over the decades, we've become better and better at using less and less land to grow the food that we're growing. So in that sense, we're making good progress, right?
Yeah, right now we are making good progress. I absolutely agree, but we need more. This is one thing. And when you look at the way that we produce food, yes, in many countries we're using less land, but it's not the same in all countries around the world.
Yeah.
When you look at farming practices, the use of water, are we using water in a way that is sustainable or not? Right now, there are many technologies that are being developed in areas where there is drought, for example, and there are certain seedlings that are drought resistant, that are able to save water. And these technologies are available in some countries, but not all over the world, even though they have the potential to save water, whether you are a country that is under a water crisis or not. And are these technologies and solutions available for everyone or available for the ones that can afford it? So this is why I'm saying that right now we are making a progress, but it's still not sufficient and we need to do more. We need to also think about how we can transfer this knowledge, these new sustainable practices to everyone, because right now it's not for all, it's for certain communities in certain countries, but it has the potential to expand and go more, especially in continents and countries that are suffering now from acute water stress and food stress, and they can definitely benefit from these new initiatives, such as for greenhouses in general, and how this is also adapting with the changing temperature, but also producing nutritious food and nutritious crops, and so on.
Okay. Yeah, I just I was kind of trying to formulate a question in my mind. Earlier on you were talking about how you got interested in the environment in general, I suppose climate in particular. I'm just really curious about why do you think, or maybe I should ask this, like, why do you think there aren't more people in the health profession who are taking an interest in the environment? Is it because of what you said about just not featuring in education around health? Or do you think it's just because it's, the average medical professional just doesn't have time to think about another major issue?
It's a combination of both. First of all, we don't learn about it in our own education. So we do not see the link between health and the environment. And this is so critical because what we learn throughout the 7 years of education, and it does not involve climate change, that we do not see any relevance or importance to it, even though when you think about it, especially during extreme or climate-related events, even if it's simply a heat wave, we do not know that in July or in the summer seasons, there will be increased temperature because of climate change. More patients are going to come to the ER presenting with heat stroke and heat stress. And if we do not diagnose this correctly, these patients are going to be harmed more than they will be treated. Then we are at the front line of the climate crisis, especially when you look at other events like hurricanes and floods and storms and our healthcare facilities do not have the early monitoring systems and the risk management systems put into place, then we're not going to be able to do our job correctly, which is to treat the patients during emergencies when we are most needed.
Mm-hmm.
And that is why I believe that it's a challenge that I'm so passionate about tackling, because I believe in the power of education. It can go a long way when you have climate conscious doctors and health professionals, nurses, as well as public health practitioners who understand climate change, who understand the crisis that it is. I remember when I attended my first, the COP in Poland, which was COP24 in 2018,
Mm-hmm.
we were around 10 medical practitioners, doctors, nurses, and healthcare professionals.
Mm-hmm.
And then in COP25 in Madrid, we became 20. In Glasgow, there was over 100 doctors and healthcare professionals, and we had our own pavilion, our own space. And then in Egypt, we were over 200. And right now, we're seeing more doctors going into the Friday for Future strikes and the climate strikes, calling on climate change as a health crisis, bringing in the urgency to the issue to really build public awareness. But also, even our workplace, our healthcare facilities, they contribute to over 3% to the global carbon emissions. So we also have our own carbon footprint, our own contribution to the problem. And that is why right now there is a huge movement around hospitals working towards A, climate resilience and able to adapt to the extreme weather events that are driven by climate change, and
Mm-hmm.
B, being environment friendly and working towards net zero as well. And the NHS, which is the healthcare system of the UK, is the first healthcare system in the world. And just last year, they committed to going towards net zero.
Mm-hmm.
And much more healthcare facilities are committing to do the same. And this was launched in COP26 in Glasgow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there certainly seems to be an incredible amount of momentum behind this movement, and that's a very good illustration of it. You know how that sort of literally exponential increase in interest from medical professionals. Do you have any idea or any sort of perception of why the environmental movement has gathered so much momentum recently? As I said earlier on, my perception is that it's really been in the last few years that things have gathered so much steam. Whereas for decades before that, you know, environmentalists were really just ignored by the mainstream media. It was really difficult to be noticed at all.
Yeah, I think it was the power of young people
Uh-huh.
not being unbiased to my opinion, but I think it's a lot of things. First is the huge number of climate strikes that were done over the past years, combined with the use of social media and the technology that we're having now,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
how much more connected we are. And literally, as young people, we naturally collaborate with one another. It became much easier over the years to connect with one another.
Mm-hmm.
I personally, started, and every time I go to an event or a conference or meet young people from around the world and see what they're facing and the realities of climate change that they are facing on a daily basis, like losing the basics that they need, their access to education, their homes, their family members. And I think that is why right now the climate movement is increasing. And because every person is seeing these impacts and we're connecting to one another and we're vocal, we're confident, we're able to say publicly our opinions without shying away from that. This really helped grow the movement at such an accelerating rate, and really reporting on what we're seeing on a daily basis, either through, and it's just easy to express what you have to say.
Right. Yeah, I think I agree with part of what you said there, because I think that social media has got to have a lot to do with it. I guess the one bit of pushback I would give is that there were young people campaigning, you know, in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. You know, there was always a very strong vanguard of young people campaigning for environmental issues, including climate. But it's really only recently that they gained the ground that they've been gaining recently. So it's still a little bit of a mystery to me, but maybe social media explains the whole thing. This the way that we can communicate as quickly as we can, not just to the broader public, but also to each other. For example, activists communicating with each other to organize and that kind of thing. I wanted to actually talk a little bit more about activism, and we don't really have much time to do it now, but I think that my sort of theory is that some of the more extreme activism, the people defacing paintings and that kind of thing, which has been in the news, it's certainly attention grabbing, but I wonder if it's not just going to have the opposite effect that's intended, that people are going to kind of get fed up with that way of engaging in activism, and that it's actually going to lose support as a result. What do you think of that? I mean, I don't really know. You've described yourself as a climate activist, but I don't picture you as someone who throws paint on Van Gogh paintings and that kind of thing.
Yeah, the way that I see activism is a bit, I think it's not different. I've worked with so many amazing young climate activists that I've learned so much over the years.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, it's about the cause. And I understand how whatever you do in your life, there are always extremes, and there's the extreme that drives change, and there's the extreme that has its own counter consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing myself as a climate activist is seeing how I truly believe in the importance of the climate crisis. And right now, I don't see myself doing anything different, and this would be my life purpose, because I believe in its urgency.
Mm-hmm.
And I also believe in the capabilities that I have now to address the issue and to really call on it in every way that I can, either through my profession as a doctor, either through my passion as someone who likes to teach and to really build capacities, especially of young people, to understand and to prioritize climate change as an issue that we all need to work on collectively, passionately. And as the person who wants to communicate the importance of the issue,
mm-hmm.
either through doing marches, or it's through sessions, or being involved in negotiations, whatever it can be. And this, for me, is how activism, because activism is very flexible as a terminology, and there's so much that you can do as an activist,
right.
But it's always for a cause that you truly believe in, and that you push all the limits to do, and really dedicate your time, your efforts, and the amount of sacrifices that you do as well as an activist. Most of us do that unpaid, and dedicate so much of our time, of our mental health and energy into that, and finding ways to support each other along the way.
Right. Next time, we'll be discussing the utility and the drawbacks of multilateral environmental agreements like the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. An important CBD meeting was held recently, or just last month as I speak, and we'll discuss its outcomes, among other things. But we'll get more deeply into what multilateral environmental agreements get right and what they perhaps don't. My guest will be Peter Bridgewater, who's had various professorial positions at different Australian universities, but more importantly, he's a veteran negotiator of multilateral environmental agreements, or MEAs. Knowing Peter and having had various discussions with him in the past, I feel confident in guaranteeing that this will be a fascinating discussion.